The courtroom was supposed to be just another stop in his rising career, but rookie officer Jake Simmons had no idea he was about to get the lesson of a lifetime. Confident, brash, and sure of his authority, he walked in believing his badge gave him the final say. But when he tried to challenge the seasoned judge presiding over the case, a black woman known for her sharp mind and unshakable presence, he quickly realized he was in over his head. The tension in the room was thick as he questioned her rulings, his arrogance on full display. But instead of raising her voice or showing frustration, the judge remained calm, her words cutting through his pride like a blade. What she revealed next left the entire courtroom silent, especially Officer Simmons. He had underestimated her, but by the time she finished speaking, he wouldn't make that mistake again. Officer Simmons clenched his jaw, trying to maintain his composure. He had dealt with plenty of judges before, some strict, some lenient, but none had ever challenged him like this. He had walked into the courtroom expecting respect, maybe even a little fear. Instead, Judge Matthews sat there, steady and unbothered, her eyes sharp as if she could see right through him. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with an unspoken challenge. Simmons shifted his weight, gripping his belt as if it would somehow restore the authority slipping from his grasp. He had been taught that officers upheld the law, that his word carried weight. But the judge's presence made him feel like a rookie all over again. Then, with a measured voice, she began to speak. Her words weren't harsh, but each one landed like a stone. As she revealed something he never saw coming, the confidence in his eyes started to fade. Judge Matthews leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on Simmons. "Tell me, officer, how long have you been on the force?" Her voice was calm, but there was something in her tone that made the question feel heavier than it seemed. Simmons squared his shoulders. "Almost a year, Your Honor." She nodded slowly, tapping her fingers on the bench. "A year," she repeated. "And in that time, you've learned everything there is to know about justice." The officer hesitated. He didn't like where this was going. "I know the law, ma'am. I enforce it." Judge Matthews studied him for a moment, then let out a quiet breath. "The law," she said, her voice carrying through the courtroom. "And yet, you stand here challenging me as if you've lived enough to understand how justice really works." Simmons shifted uncomfortably, but she wasn't finished. What she said next would shake his entire perspective and expose a truth he never saw coming. The courtroom felt smaller now, the silence stretching between them. Officer Simmons swallowed, his confidence wavering under Judge Matthews' steady gaze. He wanted to push back, to remind her that he wore a badge for a reason, but something in her presence kept him still. Judge Matthews finally leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Let me tell you a story," she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "Years ago, there was a young officer, much like yourself, smart, ambitious, but he thought the law was just black and white, rules to be followed without question." Simmons furrowed his brows, unsure where this was going. His hands clenched at his sides. "The problem," she continued, "is that justice isn't always found in a rule book." She let the words settle before adding, "And sometimes, those who think they're enforcing the law are the ones who need to learn what justice really means." The room felt heavier now. Simmons opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Judge Matthews dropped a truth that made his breath catch. The weight of her words crashed over him, leaving him standing there, speechless, as the entire courtroom waited for what would happen next. Simmons felt his pulse quicken. He had been in tense situations before, but this was different. Judge Matthews wasn't just questioning his authority, she was unraveling something deeper, something he hadn't even realized was there. She let the silence hang before continuing. "That young officer I mentioned, he made a mistake that changed someone's life forever. And do you know what happened?" Simmons shook his head slightly, unable to find his voice. Judge Matthews' eyes darkened. He was never held accountable. No one questioned him. No one challenged him. And because of that, an innocent person paid the price. A chill ran down Simmons' spine. He had walked into this courtroom sure of himself, believing he knew right from wrong. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so certain. Then, the prosecutor made his move. "Your Honor," he said quickly, his voice laced with frustration, "I request a recess." But before the judge could respond, the young man spoke. "No need," he said. "I have something to submit into evidence." The entire courtroom stilled. This wasn't part of the plan. He wasn't supposed to have anything. No lawyer, no resources, nothing that could shift the case in his favor. Yet, with the same quiet confidence he had carried all along, he pulled out a neatly folded document and handed it to the bailiff. The judge scanned the papers, his face darkening with every line he read. His grip on the document tightened, and for the first time, real fear flashed in his eyes. Whatever was on that paper wasn't just a clever argument, it was something far worse. Something that could upend everything. The courtroom held its breath, and then the judge's voice, now unsteady, broke the silence. "Where did you get this?" The young man didn't flinch. "I got it the same way I learned the law, by paying attention." His voice was calm, but the tension in the room was anything but. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he skimmed the document again. His face, once filled with confidence and condescension, was now drained of color. The prosecutor, confused, leaned over to glance at the papers. His eyes widened. "Your Honor, we need to discuss this in chambers." But it was too late. The young man turned to the jury. "That document proves I was never supposed to be on trial," he said. "It shows evidence was withheld, evidence that would have cleared me from the start." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the prosecutor, but there was nowhere to hide. The truth was out. And then the final twist. The young man took a step forward. "And one more thing," he said, his voice steady. "I know exactly who made sure that evidence disappeared." His eyes locked onto the judge's. For a long moment, the room was silent. The weight of what had just been revealed hung thick in the air. The judge swallowed hard, but the damage was done. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a reckoning. And for the first time, the person in control wasn't the one behind the bench. It was the one who was never supposed to win. The courtroom was frozen in silence. The judge, once so sure of his power, now sat stiffly, his face unreadable. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, knowing there was no way to undo what had just happened. The truth was out, and the system they had counted on to stay in control had failed them, because this young man had learned how to fight back. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and understanding. The young man had done what no one expected. He had exposed the cracks in a system meant to break him. And now there was no denying it. The judge finally let out a slow breath. "Court is adjourned," he said, his voice hollow. But as the young man turned to leave, he didn't walk out defeated. He walked out free, proving that sometimes the people who are underestimated the most are the ones who change everything.